a kingdom forged in blood. Livia Marchesi had once been royalty in their world until the night her father was betrayed and his empire fell, leaving her with nothing but a name that now meant death. She had spent a year in hiding. Now he had found her. Rafael Costa smirked, shaking his head. "You look good for a dead woman," he murmured. Chapter 1. The Ghost of a Fallen Empire. The chipped ceramic mug warmed Livia's hands, a small comfort against the pervasive chill of the pre-dawn air. From the tiny balcony of her rented apartment, Rome sprawled beneath her, a tapestry of terracotta rooftops and ancient stone, still cloaked in the indigo hues of a fading night. It was a city of ghosts, she thought, each cobblestone whispering stories of empires risen and fallen, of lives lived and lost. And she, Livia Marchesi, was just another ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had once been hers. It had been a year, 365 days since her life had imploded, since the opulent world she'd known had crumbled into dust and ashes. 1 year since the name Marchesi, once synonymous with power and respect, had become a whispered curse, a mark of death. Her father, Don Alessandro Marchesi, had been a titan, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His empire, built on a foundation of it didn't matter now, did it? It was gone, reduced to nothing by the treachery of those he'd trusted most. Livia traced the rim of the mug, her fingers lingering on a small, almost invisible crack. It was a habit, this tracing of imperfections, a subconscious search for flaws in a world that had proven itself to be fatally flawed. She'd learned, in the agonizing months of her exile, that beauty was often a deceptive veneer, concealing rot and decay beneath. The scent of brewing coffee wafted from the tiny kitchen, a simple, grounding aroma in a life that had become anything but. She'd traded silk sheets for threadbare cotton, champagne for bitter espresso, and the constant hum of security for the unsettling silence of anonymity. She was no longer Livia Marchesi, heiress to a fallen empire. She was simply Lia, a waitress at a small, unassuming trattoria tucked away in a quiet corner of Trastevere. It was a life stripped bare of all pretense, a life where she could almost forget the blood that stained her hands, the legacy that weighed her down. She'd meticulously crafted this new existence, walling herself off from the past, burying the memories deep within the recesses of her heart. But some memories she was finding refused to stay buried. A sudden, sharp rap at the door shattered the fragile peace of the morning. Livia froze, the mug slipping slightly in her grasp. Her heart, usually a steady, quiet drum, began to pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She hadn't had a visitor ever. Another rap, more insistent this time. Her breath hitched in her throat. She set the mug down on the small, rickety table, the ceramic clinking against the worn with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. She moved towards the door with slow, deliberate steps, her bare feet silent on the cool tile floor. Through the peephole, she saw him. Even blurred by the distorted lens, there was no mistaking the sharp, aristocratic features, the dark, intense eyes that seemed to pierce through the wood and into her very soul. Raffaele Costa, the son of her father's most formidable rival, Don Lorenzo Costa, the man whose family had, in the intricate, brutal dance of power that governed their world, emerged victorious from the ashes of the Marchesi Empire. Her hand trembled as she reached for the chain, the cold metal a stark contrast to the sudden, burning heat that flared through her. Why was he here? What did he want? Had he come to gloat? To finish what his family had started? 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last, swirled in her mind. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had survived this long by being invisible, by blending into the shadows. But she was a Marchesi, and even stripped of everything, the blood of a lioness still flowed through her veins. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't break. She unlatched the chain, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence, and slowly opened the door, just a crack. Signorina Marchesi, Rafael Costa said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't smile. His expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask that hid whatever intentions lay beneath. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, as if the weight of the world he now commanded rested heavily upon him. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, the fabric whispering of wealth and power, a stark contrast to her own worn, faded clothes. Livia's throat was dry. "Costa," she managed, her voice a barely audible whisper. She kept her hand on the door, ready to slam it shut if necessary. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not respect. "May I come in?" The question was a formality, a courtesy extended to a condemned prisoner before the execution. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would enter whether she permitted him or not. He was Acosta. He took what he wanted. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She could run. She could try to escape. But where would she go? He had found her here, in this carefully constructed sanctuary. He would find her anywhere. She stepped back, opening the door wider, a silent invitation, a surrender. Raphael stepped inside, his presence filling the small apartment, making it feel even smaller, even more suffocating. He glanced around, his eyes taking in the faded wallpaper, the worn furniture, the air of quiet desperation that clung to the space. He didn't sneer. He didn't judge. He simply observed. "You look good for a dead woman," he murmured, finally turning his gaze back to her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that she couldn't quite decipher. Amusement? Pity? Or something far more dangerous? Livia lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm not dead," she said, her voice stronger now, infused with a defiance that surprised even herself. "No," he agreed, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Not yet." The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of their shared history, of their family's bitter feud, hanging heavy between them. The scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, more primal, filled her senses, a reminder of the world she had tried so desperately to escape. A world of power, of danger, of secrets. A world that had now, once again, reached out to claim her. What game was he playing? Chapter 2. Echoes in the Empty Palace. Raphael's gaze lingered on Livia, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin prickle with unease. He seemed to be searching for something, some sign of the girl she had once been, the heiress who had graced ballrooms and commanded attention with effortless grace. He wouldn't find her. That Livia was gone, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed defenses. "Coffee?" she asked, the words sounding brittle even to her own ears. It was a pathetic attempt at normalcy, a desperate grasp at civility in a situation that was anything but. She gestured towards the small kitchen, the movement stiff and awkward. He inclined his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "Thank you." Livia turned away, grateful for the reprieve, however brief. She moved into the kitchen, her movements precise and economical, the familiar ritual of pouring coffee a small anchor in the storm that was raging inside her. She could feel his eyes on her back, watching her, assessing her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of the ceramic mugs and the soft hiss of the gas stove. She poured 2 cups, her hand surprisingly steady. She added a spoonful of sugar to his, remembering, with a pang of something that felt dangerously close to regret, that he preferred it that way. It was a small detail, a remnant of a past life, a life where they had, on occasion, shared a fragile, uneasy truce. She carried the mugs back into the living room, her heart pounding a steady, insistent rhythm against her ribs. He was standing by the window, looking out at the awakening city, his back to her. He was a silhouette against the growing light, a dark, imposing figure that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. She placed one mug on the small table beside him and held the other out to him. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. He took the mug, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She quickly withdrew her hand, her skin tingling where he had touched her. He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's good," he said, his voice low and smooth, like velvet over steel. Livia nodded, unable to speak. She took a sip of her own coffee, the bitter liquid burning a path down her throat. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was charged with a new kind of tension, a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Why are you here, Raphael?" she finally asked, her voice low but firm. She needed to know. She needed to understand the game he was playing. He set his mug down on the table, the sound sharp and decisive. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "I need your help," he said. The words were unexpected, throwing her off balance. Help? Why would he need her help? She was nothing, a ghost, a remnant of a fallen empire. He was the victor, the one who held all the cards. "My help?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're joking." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "I assure you, Signorina Marchesi, I am not in the habit of joking." "Then explain," she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Because I don't understand. What could you possibly need from me?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Complicated how?" she pressed. "You families destroyed mine. You took everything. What more could you possibly want?" The words were out before she could stop them, raw and bitter, revealing the pain that she had tried so hard to bury. His expression flickered, a fleeting shadow crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the carefully constructed mask he wore so well. "This isn't about the past, Livia," he said, his voice softening slightly. "This is about the future." "The future?" she scoffed. "What future?" "My future was stolen from me the night your family—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The memories were too painful, too raw. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I know what happened to your father was unjust," he said, the words sounding strained, as if they were forced from him. "But I had nothing to do with it." She looked at him, her eyes narrowed. She wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe that he was different, that he wasn't like the rest of his family. But trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Don't lie to me, Raphael," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't insult my intelligence." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. "I'm not lying," he said. "My father, he made decisions. Decisions that I didn't agree with. Decisions that I'm now trying to rectify." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "There are things happening, Livia. Things that you don't know about. Things that threaten not only my family, but everything." His words were vague, cryptic, but they sent a chill down her spine. She had spent the past year trying to escape the darkness of their world, but she knew, deep down, that it was a darkness that could never truly be escaped. It was a darkness that clung to you, that followed you, that seeped into your very soul. "What kind of things?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of urgency and something else. Something that looked almost like vulnerability. "I need you to come with me," he said. "I need to show you." He gestured towards the door, an invitation, a command. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to refuse, to stay hidden in the fragile safety of her anonymity. But there was something in his eyes, something in his voice, that compelled her. A flicker of hope, perhaps. Or maybe just curiosity. A desire to understand the forces that had shaped her life, the forces that had destroyed her family. She looked at him, at the man who represented everything she had lost, everything she feared. And yet, she found herself nodding, slowly, reluctantly. She was stepping back into the darkness, back into the world of shadows and secrets. She was walking into a trap, perhaps. But she had nothing left to lose. He offered his hand, a silent gesture. She almost refused, her heart racing at the thought of such a connection. After a moment of intense indecision, she took his hand, the warmth of the brief exchange raising questions she was not yet ready to examine. He led her to a waiting car, a silent black vehicle that seemed to blend seamlessly into the awakening cityscape. He didn't speak as they left the apartment building and made a brisk walk, his hand still gently gripping hers. Where were they going? Chapter 3. The Serpent's Unexpected Offer. The car, a sleek, black Alfa Romeo, purred to life with a barely audible rumble, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the awakening city. Raphael drove with a practiced ease, navigating the narrow, winding streets of Rome with a familiarity that spoke of a lifetime spent within these ancient walls. Livia sat beside him, her body tense, her senses on high alert. She stole glances at him, studying his profile, the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark, intense eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning the road ahead, the world around them. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left her apartment, the silence in the car thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared history. She wanted to ask him where they were going, what he meant by things happening, but the words caught in her throat. Fear, a cold, familiar companion, coiled in her stomach. The city gradually gave way to the countryside, the dense urban landscape replaced by rolling hills, vineyards, and ancient olive groves. The sun was rising higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the landscape, a deceptive beauty that masked the darkness that lurked beneath. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Raphael turned off the main road and onto a long, winding driveway lined with towering cypress trees. The trees cast long, dark shadows across the road, creating an eerie, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. At the end of the driveway, a massive villa emerged, a sprawling, centuries-old structure of weathered stone and terracotta tile. It was a palace, a fortress, a symbol of power and wealth. It was the Costa family estate. Livia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't been here since she was a child, since the days when her father and Lorenzo Costa had maintained a fragile, uneasy peace, a peace that had been shattered by betrayal and bloodshed. Memories flooded her, bittersweet and painful, of lavish parties, of whispered conversations, of the constant undercurrent of tension that had always simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly cordial relations. Raphael brought the car to a smooth stop in front of the villa. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Welcome home, Livia," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Home. The word struck her like a physical blow. This place had never been her home. It was the enemy's stronghold, the lair of the serpent that had destroyed her family. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "This isn't my home," she said, her voice trembling. "It never was." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I know," he said. "But for now, it's the safest place for you." Safest? The word seemed absurd, coming from him, coming from this place. But she knew, deep down, that he was right. She had been living on borrowed time, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. He had found her. Others could too. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had to be strong. She had to survive. She got out of the car, her legs feeling shaky and unsteady. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a scent that brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. The villa loomed before her, imposing and magnificent, a silent testament to the power of the Costa family. Raphael came around the car and stood beside her, his presence a source of both comfort and unease. "Come," he said, his voice softer now. "There's someone I want you to meet." He led her towards the villa, his hand hovering near her back, but not quite touching her. She walked beside him, her head held high, her back straight. She wouldn't show him her fear. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. They entered the villa through a massive, arched doorway into a vast, high-ceilinged hall. The interior was even more opulent than she remembered, filled with priceless antiques, Renaissance paintings, and intricate mosaics. It was a museum, a mausoleum, a testament to generations of Costa power and wealth. But it was also empty. The silence was deafening, the air thick with the weight of the past. There were no servants bustling about, no laughter echoing through the halls, no signs of life. It was as if the villa itself were holding its breath, waiting. Raphael led her through a series of corridors, each more lavish than the last, until they reached a large, oak-paneled door. He paused, his hand on the ornate brass handle. "He's waiting for you," he said, his voice low and serious.
He.
Livia's heart pounded against her ribs.
Who was he?
Another Costa?
A rival?
An enemy? Raphael opened the door, revealing a dimly lit study. The room was dominated by a massive, antique desk, behind which sat an elderly man, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes sharp and intelligent, despite the frail body. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, the fabric whispering of old money and quiet power. He looked familiar. The old man looked up, his gaze settling on Livia. A flicker of recognition, of surprise, crossed his face. He slowly rose from his chair, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Livia Marchesi," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "It's been a long time." Livia stared at him, her mind racing. She knew this man. She had seen him before, years ago, at one of her father's parties. He had been a shadowy figure, always on the periphery, never directly involved in the business. But she remembered his name. "Don Angelo," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
Angelo Rossi.
One of her father's oldest and supposedly most trusted advisors, a man whispered to possess an almost mythical understanding of the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that made up their world. A man who had disappeared the night her father died. A man she had thought was dead. He offered her a small, sad smile. "The very same. And I believe, my dear, that we have much to discuss." Raphael remained standing in the doorway, a quiet, watching presence, a barrier or an ally. She still wasn't sure. What was Rossi doing here, and why did Raphael bring her to him? Chapter 4. A Cage of Gilded Promises. Don Angelo Rossi gestured towards a pair of plush, leather armchairs, facing his desk. "Please sit down, both of you." His voice, though aged, held a subtle authority that commanded obedience. Livia hesitated, her gaze flickering between Rossi and Raphael. She still didn't understand what was happening, why she was here, in the heart of the Coaster estate, with a man she had believed to be dead. The air in the study was thick with unspoken secrets, with the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. Raphael gave her a subtle nod, a silent reassurance, and she reluctantly moved towards one of the armchairs, sinking into its soft, yielding embrace. Raphael took the seat beside her, his presence a solid, grounding force in the midst of her swirling confusion. Rossi settled back into his own chair, his gaze fixed on Livia. "You must have many questions," he said, his voice a low rumble. Livia nodded, her throat dry. "Everything. I don't understand any of this. Why am I here? Why did you bring me here, Raphael?" She turned to Raphael, her voice laced with a mixture of confusion and accusation. Raphael met her gaze, his expression serious. "I told you, Livia, there are things happening. Things that threaten us all. Don Angelo can explain it better than I can." Livia turned back to Rossi, her eyes narrowed. "Explain what? What things? And why involve me? I'm nothing. I have nothing." Rossi sighed, his gaze softening slightly. "You are not nothing, Livia. You are Marchesi. And that name, even now, carries weight. It carries a legacy. A legacy of death and betrayal," Livia retorted, her voice bitter. "My father is dead. His empire is gone. What legacy are you talking about?" "Your father was a great man, Livia," Rossi said, his voice firm. "He made mistakes, yes, but he also had vision. He had plans. Plans that were cut short by his untimely demise." "Plans?" Livia repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "What plans? And what do they have to do with me?" Rossi leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Your father, Livia, was not just a businessman. He was a protector. He understood the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of our world, the threats that constantly threatened to tear it apart. He was building an alliance, a network of powerful families to counter those threats.
En alliance?
Livia scoffed. An alliance that failed miserably, I might add. It was betrayed. Rossi corrected her, his voice sharp. Betrayed from within. By those he trusted most. Livia's mind raced. She remembered the whispers, the rumors, the speculation that had surrounded her father's death. It hadn't been a simple power grab by the Costas, as she had always believed. There had been something more, something deeper, something far more sinister. Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who betrayed him? Rossi hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Raphael. That is a complicated question, he said, and one that we are still trying to answer. He paused, his gaze returning to Livia. But what is important, Livia, is that your father's vision didn't die with him. The alliance, it still exists. It's fragmented, weakened, but it's still there. And it needs a leader. It needs you. Livia stared at him, stunned. She was supposed to lead an alliance of powerful mafia families? It was absurd. She was a waitress, a ghost, a nobody. She had no experience, no power, no resources. You're insane, she said, her voice shaking. I can't do that. I'm not my father. No, you're not, Rossi agreed. You're stronger.
You've survived.
You've learned to adapt, to be resourceful. You have the Marchesi blood, the Marchesi intelligence, the Marchesi fire. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze assessing. I know this is a lot to take in, Livia, but I wouldn't have asked Raphael to bring you here if I didn't believe you were capable. I've been watching you, Livia. I've seen how you've handled yourself, how you've survived. You have the potential to be extraordinary. Raphael spoke for the first time since they had sat down. He's right, Livia, he said, his voice low and earnest. You have a strength that you don't even realize. And you have a responsibility. A responsibility to your father's legacy, to the families who still believe in his vision. Livia looked at him, her eyes searching his. She wanted to believe him, to believe that there was a purpose to her suffering, a meaning to her survival. But fear, a cold, paralyzing fear, held her captive. This was a dangerous game, a game where the stakes were life and death. She could be walking into a trap set by Rossi, by Raphael, by she didn't even know who. I need time, she said, her voice trembling. I need time to think. Rossi nodded, his expression understanding.
Of course, he said.
You can stay here at the villa. You'll be safe here. And you'll have time to consider my offer. An offer. It sounded more like a gilded cage, a prison disguised as a sanctuary. But she knew she had no choice. She was trapped. Trapped by her past, by her name, by the forces that were now swirling around her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. A game she didn't want to play. But she had to play. She had to survive. She looked at Raphael, a silent plea in her eyes. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. But she saw something there, a flicker of something. Hope? Protection? Or something far more dangerous? She rose on unsteady legs and looked at Rossi. I will need to get my things, she began, and Rossi nodded in understanding. Raphael will take you, Rossi said, his eyes flickering to his grandson. But Livia couldn't read anything in his face, only the weight of an old man burdened by secrets. What had she just agreed to? Chapter 5. Masks and Midnight Confessions. The return journey to Livia's apartment was shrouded in a silence far more profound than before. The Alfa Romeo felt less like a luxurious vehicle and more like a mobile confessional, the unspoken words and unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. Livia stared out the window, the Roman cityscape blurring into a meaningless stream of lights and shadows, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She kept replaying Rossi's words, his unexpected offer, his insistence on her supposed strength and responsibility. It felt like a cruel joke, a twisted game orchestrated by forces she couldn't comprehend. And Raphael's role in all of this remained a frustrating enigma. He was the son of her family's enemy, the heir to the Costa Empire, yet he had brought her to Rossi, seemingly aligning himself with a faction that opposed his own father. It made no sense. She glanced at him, his profile stark and unyielding in the dim light of the car. He drove with the same focused intensity as before, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was a closed book, a fortress of secrets, and she felt a desperate urge to pry him open, to understand the motivations that drove him. "Why are you doing this, Raphael?" she finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. The question had been simmering within her, growing more insistent with each passing mile. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on the road. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the distant wail of a siren. "I told you," he said finally, his voice low and even. "There are things happening. Things that threaten us all. But why me?" She persisted. "Why involve me? I'm nothing to you. I'm the enemy." He glanced at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable in the fleeting glow of the streetlights. "You're not the enemy, Livia," he said, his voice softer now. "Not anymore." "Then what am I?" she challenged, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated, his gaze returning to the road. "You're a complication," he said finally. "A dangerous complication." The words sent a shiver down her spine. A complication. Was that all she was to him? A problem to be solved, a pawn to be manipulated? "And Rossi?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why should I trust him? He disappeared the night my father died."
He could have been involved.
Raphael sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that she was beginning to recognize. "He wasn't involved," he said firmly. "He was protecting himself. He knew things that would have put him in danger. He had to disappear. And now he's back," Livia said, her voice skeptical. "And he wants me to lead some alliance. It's ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous, Livia," Raphael said, his voice taking on a new urgency. "It's necessary. My father, he's losing control. He's making alliances with dangerous people. People who don't respect the old ways, the old codes. People who would destroy everything." Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. She had always believed that Lorenzo Costa was the ultimate villain, the mastermind behind her family's downfall. But now, Raphael was suggesting that his father was a pawn himself? Or perhaps simply a man losing his grip on power, making desperate, dangerous choices. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Where do you fit into all of this?" He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I'm trying to fix it," he said finally, his voice strained. "I'm trying to save what's left." They arrived at her apartment building, the familiar sight offering a fleeting sense of comfort, a reminder of the life she was about to leave behind, perhaps forever. Raphael parked the car, the silence returning, heavier now, more charged. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to do this, Livia," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "You can walk away. I can make sure you're safe somewhere far from here." The offer was tempting, a lifeline in the midst of the storm. She could disappear again, start a new life, forget about the Marqueses, the Costas, the darkness that had consumed her family. But she knew she couldn't. She had been running for a year, hiding in the shadows, trying to escape her past. But the past had found her. And now, she had a chance, however slim, to reclaim something, to fight back, to make a difference. "No," she said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. "I can't run anymore." He nodded, a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect? Admiration? Or perhaps just relief. He got out of the car and came around to open her door, a gesture of courtesy that felt strangely out of place in their current circumstances. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the car. She quickly gathered a small collection of things, not bothering with anything that couldn't fit in one bag. As they were leaving, she stopped at the doorway. "Raphael." He turned to face her, his expression a question. "Why did you call me a dangerous complication?" She hadn't forgotten. He said nothing at first, his gaze intense. He reached out a hand and gently cupped her cheek. "Because, Livia Marchesi, you make me question everything." He said nothing further, but quietly led her back outside. The ride to the villa was silent, but this time, It felt less about what was happening and more about the two of them. What was starting to happen between them? Chapter 6. The Weight of Unforgiven Sins. The Costa Villa, in the dead of night, felt even more imposing, more like a mausoleum than a home. The silence that had been noticeable during the day was now a suffocating presence, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient wood and the distant howl of a dog. Livia followed Raphael through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, her heart pounding a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. He led her to a guest room, a lavishly appointed space that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place to sleep. Antique furniture, heavy drapes, and a massive four-poster bed dominated the room, the air thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax. It was a far cry from her small, humble apartment, a stark reminder of the world she had been thrust back into. "You'll be safe here," Raphael said, his voice low and reassuring, though the words felt hollow even to him. He knew the villa was a fortress, but fortresses could be breached, secrets could be revealed, and loyalties could shift like the sands of the desert. Livia nodded, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the opulence, the suffocating grandeur. "Thank you," she said, the words sounding formal and distant, even to her own ears. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the door, as if he wanted to say something more, but then he simply nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible movement. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk more in the morning." He left, closing the door behind him with a soft click, leaving Livia alone in the silence, alone with her thoughts, her fears, her growing unease. She walked over to the window, drawing back the heavy drapes, and looked out at the moonlit landscape. The gardens were shrouded in shadows, the cypress trees standing like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of the estate. She could see the faint glow of lights in the distance, a reminder of the city, of the world that lay beyond these walls, a world that felt both familiar and terrifyingly distant. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled deep within her bones. It wasn't just the physical cold of the night, it was the coldness of fear, of uncertainty, of the weight of the past that pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. She thought of her father, of the man he had been, the power he had wielded, the legacy he had left behind. She had always admired him, idolized him, even as she had been aware of the darkness that surrounded him, the shadows that clung to his empire. She had never wanted any part of that world, preferring the quiet simplicity of books and art to the dangerous games of power and intrigue. But now, she was being asked to step into his shoes, to lead an alliance of families, to navigate the treacherous waters of their world. It was a daunting task, a terrifying responsibility, and she felt woefully unprepared. She turned away from the window, her gaze falling on the small bag she had brought with her, containing the few possessions she had managed to salvage from her old life. She opened the bag, her fingers tracing the familiar objects, a worn copy of her favorite novel, a small, silver-framed photograph of her parents, a delicate porcelain doll that had been a gift from her grandmother. She picked up the photograph, her fingers lingering on the image of her father, his strong features, his confident smile, the hint of steel in his eyes. He looked so alive, so invincible. It was hard to believe that he was gone, that his empire had crumbled, that she was now left to pick up the pieces. A wave of grief washed over her, a raw, aching pain that she had tried so hard to suppress. She had been strong for so long, burying her emotions, focusing on survival, on building a new life for herself. But here, in this opulent cage, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, her defenses were crumbling. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand, tears streaming down her face. She cried for her father, for her lost life, for the future that had been stolen from her. She cried for the fear that consumed her, for the uncertainty that lay ahead. She didn't know how long she cried, but eventually, the tears subsided, leaving her feeling drained and empty. She wiped her eyes, her gaze falling on the porcelain doll, its delicate features, its painted smile, a fragile reminder of innocence and beauty in a world that was anything but. She picked up the doll, holding it close, drawing a small measure of comfort from its familiar presence. She had to be strong. She had to find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to honor her father's legacy, to survive. She placed the doll on the bedside table, beside the photograph of her parents. She changed into a simple nightgown, the soft fabric a welcome contrast to the rough, unfamiliar feel of the bedsheets. She climbed into the massive bed, the mattress sinking beneath her weight, the silence of the room pressing down on her. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the thoughts, the fears, the uncertainties that swirled in her mind. She needed to sleep, to rest, to gather her strength. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too active, too restless, replaying the events of the day, questioning Raphael's motives, Rossi's offer, her own sanity. A sudden noise startled her, a faint creak from the hallway outside her room. She held her breath, listening intently. Silence. Then another creak, closer this time. Someone was outside her door. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding against her ribs. Was it Raphael? Rossi? Or someone else? Someone who meant her harm? She reached for the small, antique lamp on the bedside table, her hand trembling. If it was an intruder, she would at least have something to defend herself with. The door slowly creaked open, a sliver of light spilling into the room. Livia held her breath, her grip tightening on the lamp. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and dark, his features obscured by the shadows. Livia? It was Raphael. Relief washed over her, so intense that it left her weak. But the relief was quickly followed by a new wave of unease. Why was he here? What did he want? He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, plunging them both into near darkness. The only light came from the moon, filtering through the gaps in the drapes, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I couldn't sleep, he said, his voice low and hesitant. He was still dressed, a dark form in the shadows. Livia didn't speak, her heart still pounding, her senses on high alert. He moved closer, his presence filling the room, making it feel even smaller, even more suffocating. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of his cologne, a mixture of sandalwood and something darker, more primal. Are you all right? He asked, his voice softer now, laced with concern. I heard a noise, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his gaze searching hers in the dim light. It was probably just the house settling, he said. It's old. It makes noises. But she knew it wasn't just the house. It was the weight of the past, the weight of the secrets that lurked within these walls, the weight of the unspoken tension that hung between them. He was standing close to her now, so close that she could feel his breath on her face. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, trying to decipher the emotions that flickered beneath the surface. Why are you really here, Raphael? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting, electric touch. She didn't pull away. I told you, he said, his voice rough, his gaze locked on hers. You make me question everything. He confessed again. It was the truth, but not all of it. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear and a hint of something much more dangerous that made his heart pound against his own chest. Would she ever trust him? And if she did, what would happen then? Chapter 7. Whispers of rebellion and desire. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged with unspoken emotions. Raphael's hand lingered on Livia's cheek, his touch sending a shiver down her spine, a sensation that was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. She could feel the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze, and it made her breath catch in her throat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching his. She needed to understand, to break through the walls he had built around himself, to see the man beneath the mask. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze dropping to her lips, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw, a slow, deliberate movement that made her skin tingle. He was so close, his presence overwhelming, and she felt a strange, unfamiliar pull towards him, a magnetic force that defied logic and reason. "I mean," he said finally, his voice rough, his gaze returning to her eyes, "that you make me question everything I've ever believed, everything I've ever been taught. You make me want things that I shouldn't want." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the weight of their family's history, of their forbidden attraction. She knew what he meant. She felt it too, this dangerous, undeniable pull, this yearning for something that was both terrifying and irresistible. "We shouldn't," she began, her voice trembling, but he cut her off, his fingers pressing gently against her lips, silencing her. "I know," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But I can't stay away from you." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face, his eyes dark and intense, filled with a mixture of desire and something else. Something that looked almost like vulnerability. She could see the conflict raging within him, the battle between duty and desire, between the man he was expected to be and the man he wanted to be. She reached up, her hand touching his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the stubble rough beneath her fingertips. She could feel the tension in his body, the coiled energy that seemed to hum beneath his skin. "Raphael," she whispered, his name a plea, a question, a surrender. He closed his eyes, his head tilting slightly, as if he were savoring the feel of her touch, the sound of her voice. Then he opened his eyes, his gaze locking on hers, and he lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss, a question asked, a promise offered. Livia's breath hitched in her throat. She had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with this intensity, this tenderness, this raw, aching need. It was a kiss that spoke of forbidden desires, of unspoken longings, of a connection that defied logic and reason. She responded, hesitantly at first, her lips parting slightly beneath his, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding, a silent conversation between two souls, a dance on the edge of a precipice. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he were afraid she would disappear. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, her body molding against his, the warmth of his embrace a welcome refuge from the coldness of her fear. The kiss went on and on, a timeless moment, a stolen embrace in the heart of a forbidden world. It was a kiss that could change everything, that could shatter the fragile peace, that could ignite a war. But in that moment, Livia didn't care. She didn't care about the consequences, about the risks, about the danger. She only cared about the man who was holding her, the man who was kissing her, the man who was making her feel alive again. Finally, reluctantly, Raphael pulled away, his breath ragged, his eyes dark with passion, with regret, with something else. Something that she couldn't quite decipher. "We shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough, his hand still cupping her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Livia nodded, her body still trembling, her mind reeling from the intensity of the kiss. She knew he was right. It was a mistake, a dangerous game, a betrayal of everything they were supposed to be. "I know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. But she didn't regret it. She couldn't regret it. It was a moment of truth, a glimpse of something real, something beautiful, in a world that was filled with lies and deception. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if he were trying to read her thoughts, to understand the emotions that were swirling within her. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression troubled.
"I don't know," he said. "I don't know what happens now."
The uncertainty in his voice mirrored her own. They had crossed a line, a dangerous, invisible boundary, and there was no going back. They were caught in a web of their own making, a web of desire and duty, of love and betrayal. But as she looked into the dark and intense eyes before her, for the first time since her father's murder, Livia felt a sense of something different in the dangerous and uncertain world they were now bound together in. A sense of hope. But what if it were false? Chapter 8. Scars Beneath the Surface. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes, painting the room in muted shades of gold and amber. Livia awoke slowly, her body heavy, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. The memory of Raphael's kiss lingered on her lips, a phantom sensation that sent a shiver down her spine. She sat up in bed, pushing the heavy covers aside, and looked around the room. It felt different this morning, less like a prison, more like a sanctuary. Or perhaps it was just her perspective that had shifted. She rose and walked over to the window, drawing back the drapes, and looked out at the gardens. The sun was shining brightly, the sky a clear, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the darkness that had shrouded the villa the night before. She could see Raphael walking in the gardens below, his figure tall and imposing against the backdrop of the manicured lawns and ancient trees. He was pacing back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed, as if he were deep in thought, or perhaps in turmoil. She watched him for a long moment, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and confusion. She didn't understand him, this man who was both her enemy and her something else. She didn't understand the forces that drove him, the secrets that he held, the conflict that raged within him. But she knew one thing. She was drawn to him, irresistibly, dangerously drawn to him. And she knew that their kiss, that stolen moment of passion, had changed everything. She turned away from the window, her gaze falling on the small, silver-framed photograph of her parents on the bedside table. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the image of her father, his confident smile, the hint of steel in his eyes. She wondered what he would think of her now, of the choices she was making, of the path she was taking. Would he be proud? Disappointed? Afraid for her? She sighed, placing the photograph back on the table. She couldn't know what he would think. She could only do what she believed was right, what she felt was necessary. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for his legacy, for the families who still believed in his vision. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple, dark dress that felt both comfortable and appropriate. She had no idea what the day would hold, what challenges she would face, what decisions she would have to make. But she was ready, or at least she would try to be. She left the room and walked down the long, silent corridor, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She found Raphael in the dining room, a vast, opulent space that felt even more overwhelming in the bright light of day. He was sitting at the head of a long, polished table, a cup of coffee in his hand, his expression somber. He looked up as she entered, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something in their depths. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and even. "Good morning," she replied, her voice equally subdued. She sat down across from him, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken words, with the memory of their kiss, with the uncertainty of their future. A servant, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and watchful eyes, entered the room, carrying a tray laden with food. She placed the tray on the table, her movements silent and efficient, and then retreated, leaving them alone. Livia looked at the food, a lavish spread of pastries, fruit, and eggs, but she had no appetite. Her stomach was in knots, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm, breaking the silence. Raphael nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I know," he said. "About last night," she began, but he cut her off, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers, a gesture of reassurance, of connection. Last night was he hesitated, searching for the right words. A mistake. A beautiful mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Livia nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and disappointment. She knew he was right. It was a mistake, a dangerous complication, a betrayal of everything they were supposed to be. But it had also been something else. Something real, something powerful, something she couldn't simply dismiss. "We can't let it happen again," he continued, his voice low and serious. "It's too dangerous. For both of us." "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But even as she said the words, she knew it wouldn't be that easy. The connection between them was too strong, too intense, too undeniable. They were caught in a web of their own making, a web of desire and duty, of love and betrayal. Rossi wants to meet with the other families, Raphael said, changing the subject, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. He wants to introduce you, to present you as the new leader of the alliance. Livia's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. It was really happening. She was being thrust into the heart of their world, into a role she had never wanted, a role she felt woefully unprepared for.
When?
She managed to ask, her voice a croak.
Tomorrow, he said.
He took a sip of his coffee and reached across to take Livia's hand and looked her in the eyes. We will do this together. I will be right there with you. He was offering his support, but she wondered if he was also reminding her who had the real power. And she also knew the we he was referring to was more than just about the meeting. It was about them. How could they possibly navigate this? Chapter 9. A dance on the edge of betrayal. The day passed in a blur of preparations and hushed conversations. Livia spent most of it with Rossi, poring over documents, learning about the families that made up the alliance, their strengths, their weaknesses, their hidden agendas. It was a crash course in the intricate, brutal politics of their world, a world where loyalty was a fleeting commodity and betrayal was a constant threat. Rossi was a patient teacher, his knowledge vast and his insights sharp. He explained the history of the alliance, the rivalries that simmered beneath the surface, the threats that loomed on the horizon. He spoke of her father with respect, with admiration, but also with a hint of regret. Your father was a visionary, Rossi said, his voice low and reflective. But he was also stubborn. He refused to see the dangers that were closing in on him. He trusted the wrong people. Livia nodded, her heart aching with a familiar pain. She knew her father had made mistakes, that his trust had been misplaced, that his ambition had ultimately led to his downfall. But she also believed in his vision, in his desire to create a more stable, more secure world for their families. I won't make the same mistakes, she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Rossi's. I'll be more cautious, more discerning. I'll listen to advice, but I'll make my own decisions. Rossi smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible movement of his lips.
Good, he said.
That's what your father would have wanted. But even as she spoke the words, Livia felt a sense of unease, a nagging doubt that whispered in the back of her mind. She was stepping into a world she didn't fully understand, a world where appearances were deceptive and trust was a luxury she could ill afford. She spent the evening with Raphael, a quiet, tense dinner in the vast, empty dining room. They spoke little, the unspoken words, the unresolved tension, hanging heavy between them. Their kiss, that stolen moment of passion, was a forbidden memory, a dangerous secret that they both tried to ignore, but couldn't quite forget. After dinner, Raphael led her to the villa's library, a vast, high-ceilinged room filled with thousands of books, their leather-bound spines gleaming in the soft light of the antique lamps. It was a sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation, a refuge from the darkness that surrounded them. My grandfather built this library, Raphael said, his voice low and reverent, as he gestured around the room. He loved books. He believed they held the key to understanding the world. Livia nodded, her gaze sweeping the shelves, taking in the vast collection of knowledge, of wisdom, of stories. She had always loved books, finding solace in their pages, escaping into worlds far removed from her own. It's beautiful, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Raphael smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that softened his features, making him look younger, more vulnerable. It's my favorite place in the villa, he said. It's where I come to escape. He walked over to a window seat, overlooking the gardens, and sat down, patting the cushion beside him, inviting her to join him. Livia hesitated for a moment, then moved towards him, sinking into the plush cushions, her body close to his, but not quite touching. They sat in silence for a long moment, looking out at the moonlit landscape, the cypress trees standing like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of the estate. The silence was comfortable, companionable, a welcome respite from the tension that had been simmering between them all day. "Are you afraid?" Raphael asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the gardens. Livia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I am." She was afraid of failing, of making the wrong decisions, of betraying her father's legacy. She was afraid of the enemies that lurked in the shadows, of the threats that loomed on the horizon. And she was afraid of him, of the feelings he stirred within her, of the dangerous path they were walking. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, his expression serious. "Don't be," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let anything happen to you." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they sent a shiver down her spine. He was Acosta, the son of her family's enemy, the heir to a legacy of violence and betrayal. She shouldn't trust him. She couldn't trust him.
But she wanted to.
She desperately wanted to believe that he was different, that he wasn't like the rest of his family, that he genuinely cared about her safety, about her future. He reached for her hand and gently held it. "Livia," he began, his voice low and rough. "I know what my family did to yours was wrong.
I can never make up for that."
He paused. "But I swear, I am not my father, and I need you to trust me." He was looking at her, pleading with his eyes, desperate. Could she really trust the man who had been raised her enemy, but who now seemed to be her only ally? Could she risk everything for the man she had kissed, and who made her feel things she never thought possible? As she returned his earnest gaze, she had only one terrifying thought. She already was. Chapter 10. The Price of Protection and Loyalty. The next day dawned gray and ominous, the sky heavy with the threat of rain, a mirror of the turbulent emotions churning within Livia. Today was the day. The day she would face the families of the Alliance, the day she would step into her father's shoes, the day she would either rise to the challenge or be consumed by it. She dressed carefully, choosing a black dress that was both elegant and understated, a dress that projected an image of strength and confidence, even though she felt anything but. She added a simple, silver necklace, a gift from her mother, a tangible reminder of her family, of her heritage, of the legacy she was now carrying. She met Raphael and Rossi in the villa's entrance hall. Raphael was dressed in a dark suit, his expression serious, his eyes watchful. Rossi wore his usual impeccable attire, his face lined with age and experience, his gaze sharp and intelligent. "Are you ready?" Rossi asked, his voice low and steady. Livia took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. They left the villa in a convoy of black cars, a silent procession winding its way through the Roman countryside, towards an unknown destination. Livia sat beside Raphael in the back of the lead car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her senses on high alert. She stole glances at him, studying his profile, the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark, intense eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning the road ahead, the world around them. He was a closed book, a fortress of secrets, but she had seen glimpses of the man beneath the mask, the man who had kissed her, the man who had promised to protect her. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "To a neutral location," Raphael replied, his voice equally low. "A place where all the families feel safe." Safe. The word seemed ironic, given the circumstances. They were entering a den of vipers, a gathering of powerful, ruthless individuals, each with their own agenda, their own loyalties, their own secrets. The convoy eventually arrived at a secluded estate, a sprawling, modern villa hidden behind high walls and guarded by armed men. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, a place where deals were made, alliances were forged, and betrayals were plotted. They were ushered into a large conference room, a sterile, impersonal space dominated by a long, polished table. The room was already filled with people, the representatives of the various families, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and hostility. Livia felt a wave of fear wash over her, a cold, paralyzing fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She was an outsider, an intruder, a woman stepping into a man's world, a world where weakness was exploited and vulnerability was punished. But she couldn't show her fear. She had to be strong, confident, unwavering. She had to project an image of power, of authority, of leadership. Raphael placed a hand on her lower back, a subtle gesture of support, of reassurance, a silent promise of protection. She drew strength from his touch, from his presence, from the unspoken connection that bound them together. Rossi stepped forward, his voice booming across the room, silencing the murmurs and whispers. "Gentlemen," he said, his gaze sweeping the assembled families, "I present to you Livia Marchesi, the daughter of Alessandro Marchesi, the rightful heir to his legacy, the new leader of our alliance." The room was silent, the air thick with tension, with anticipation, with judgment. All eyes were on Livia, scrutinizing her, assessing her, questioning her. She stepped forward, her head held high, her back straight, her gaze meeting the eyes of each family representative one by one. She could feel their hostility, their skepticism, their resentment. They saw her as a weak, inexperienced girl, an easy target, a pawn to be manipulated. "My father is dead," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating across the room. "His empire was destroyed, but his vision lives on. He believed in an alliance, in a united front against our enemies, in a world where our families could thrive, not just survive." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, holding their attention. "I share that vision," she continued. "I believe in the power of unity, in the strength of loyalty, in the importance of honor." She spoke of her father's legacy, of the need for cooperation, of the threats they faced, of the future she envisioned. She spoke with passion, with conviction, with fire. But she also spoke of change, of modernization, of adapting to the new realities of their world. She challenged their assumptions, questioned their traditions, proposed new strategies. Some of the family representatives listened intently, their expressions thoughtful, their eyes considering. Others scoffed, their faces hardening with disapproval, their gazes filled with contempt. One man, a burly, older man with a scarred face and cold, cruel eyes, stood up, interrupting her. "You're a child," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A woman. You know nothing of our world. You have no right to lead us." Livia met his gaze head-on, her chin lifting slightly, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I may be young," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but I am a Marchesi, and I am not afraid. I will not be intimidated, and I will not back down." The room was silent again, the tension thicker than ever. Raphael stepped forward, his hand moving to the small of her back again, a silent warning, a subtle threat. His presence was a reminder of his power, of his family's influence, of the protection he offered, and the price she might have to pay for it. He stood at her side, a silent statement that he was with her. It calmed her and gave her the strength to finish. She knew that this was just the beginning. The meeting was adjourned, and it was clear. She had allies, she had enemies, and she would have to carefully tread forward to survive. But one thing was certain, they knew she was a force to be reckoned with now. How much of one remained to be seen. Chapter 11. Shattered Reflections of the Past. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Livia found herself immersed in the intricate, often brutal, world of the Alliance, a world of secret meetings, coded messages, and constant power struggles. She spent hours with Rossi, learning the nuances of their business, the delicate balance of power between the families, the ever-present threat of betrayal. She also saw more of Raphael, their interactions a complex dance of cautious trust and undeniable attraction. They worked together, strategizing, negotiating, navigating the treacherous waters of their world. He was her advisor, her protector, her confidant. But he was also a constant reminder of the dangerous path they were walking, of the forbidden feelings that simmered beneath the surface. One evening, After a particularly grueling meeting with one of the more recalcitrant families, Livia found herself alone in the villa's library, seeking solace in the quiet company of books. She was browsing the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of ancient volumes, when she came across a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a dark corner. She pulled it out, her curiosity piqued. The cover was worn and faded, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, her heart beating faster as she recognized the handwriting on the first page. It was her father's. She sank into a nearby armchair, her hands trembling as she began to read. The journal was a chronicle of her father's life, his thoughts, his ambitions, his fears. It was a window into his soul, a glimpse of the man behind the mask, the man she had both idolized and feared. He wrote of his early days, his rise to power, the challenges he faced, the enemies he made. He wrote of his love for her mother, his hopes for Livia, his desire to build a better world for his family. But he also wrote of his doubts, his regrets, his sins. He wrote of the decisions he had made, the compromises he had been forced to accept, the darkness that had clung to him, threatening to consume him. Livia read on, her heart aching with a mixture of love, grief, and understanding. She saw her father in a new light, not just as a powerful, ruthless leader, but as a flawed, vulnerable human being, struggling to navigate a treacherous world, to protect his family, to achieve his vision. She came across a passage that made her breath catch in her throat. He wrote of his alliance with Lorenzo Costa, of his initial trust, of his growing suspicion, of the betrayal that had ultimately led to his downfall. He wrote of a secret, a hidden agreement, a pact made with the devil, a sacrifice that had been demanded in exchange for power, for security, for survival. Livia's blood ran cold. She read the passage again and again, her mind reeling, her heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't believe what she was reading. It was a revelation, a shattering truth that threatened to destroy everything she had ever believed about her father, about her family, about her world. A noise behind her startled her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, and saw Raphael standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked almost like guilt. "Livia?" he said, his voice low and hesitant. "What's wrong?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she held out the journal. "Read this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Read what your father made mine do." He took the journal, his gaze flickering between her and the worn pages. He read the passage, his expression changing, his face paling, his eyes widening with shock, with horror, with shame. He closed the journal, his hand gripping it tightly, his knuckles white. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I didn't know," he said, his voice rough, his words strained. "I swear, Livia, I had no idea." Livia stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to find solace in his arms. But the truth was staring her in the face, a truth that shattered the fragile foundation of their relationship, a truth that revealed the depth of the betrayal, the weight of the sins that had been committed. It confirmed everything. Raphael's family was the reason her father was dead, even if Raphael was not directly responsible. He took a step toward her. "Livia, please," she shook her head. "I need some air." She brushed past him, needing to get away, to escape the crushing truth that had just been uncovered. How could she possibly move forward with him now? Could their fragile bond ever overcome this? Chapter 12. Blood Ties and Broken Vows. Livia fled the villa, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the library, of the secrets that had been revealed, of the betrayal that had shattered her world. She walked blindly, her feet carrying her through the darkened gardens, past the silent cypress trees, towards the edge of the estate. She found herself at a small, secluded overlook, a place where she could see the lights of Rome twinkling in the distance, a reminder of the life she had once known, the life that had been stolen from her. She sat down on a stone bench, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the revelations in her father's journal. The truth was a heavy burden, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. Her father, the man she had idolized, had been complicit in his own downfall, had made a pact with the devil, had sacrificed everything for power, for security, for a vision that had ultimately crumbled into dust. And Raphael, the man she had allowed herself to care for, the man who had kissed her, the man who had promised to protect her, was the son of her father's betrayer, the heir to a legacy of violence and deceit. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled deep within her bones. It wasn't just the physical cold of the night, it was the coldness of betrayal, of disillusionment, of the realization that the world she had believed in was a lie, a carefully constructed facade that had now been shattered. She heard footsteps behind her, the crunch of gravel underfoot, and she knew it was Raphael. She didn't turn, didn't want to face him, didn't want to see the pity, the guilt, the shame in his eyes. He sat down beside her, not touching her, leaving a space between them, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that had opened up between them. "Livia," he said, his voice low and rough, "I'm so sorry." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the distant lights of the city, her heart aching with a pain that was almost unbearable. "I didn't know," he continued, his voice strained. "I swear, I had no idea about the agreement, about the sacrifice. My father, he kept things from me. He kept things from everyone." Livia finally turned to him, her eyes filled with tears, with anger, with betrayal. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice cold and distant. "It doesn't change anything.
Your family destroyed mine.
Your father, he killed mine." Raphael flinched, as if she had struck him. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I can never make up for that. But I'm not my father, Livia. I'm not him. Aren't you?" She challenged, her voice rising slightly. "You're Costa. You're bound by blood, by loyalty, by tradition. You can't escape that, Raphael. You can't just walk away." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "I'm trying," he said, his voice rough. "I'm trying to be different. I'm trying to break the cycle." "It's too late," she said, her voice shaking. "The damage is done. The trust is broken. There's nothing left, Raphael. Nothing." She stood up, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She needed to get away from him, from the villa, from the memories, from the pain. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice filled with alarm. He stood up too, his hand reaching out to her, but she recoiled from his touch. "Away," she said, her voice cold and final. "Away from here. Away from you." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone in the darkness, the silence broken only by the rustling of the leaves in the wind, by the distant sounds of the city, by the echo of her words, by the shattering of their fragile, forbidden love. She returned to her old apartment, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. This had been her sanctuary, and now it was all she had left. She knew she was not safe, and she was running out of options. Rossi would be looking for her, and she was certain Raphael would be too. She had to leave Rome, leave Italy, start fresh somehow again. But she had to decide what to do about the alliance, about her father's legacy. It was all crumbling just like before. As she began packing the small bag she'd brought from the villa, she heard a firm knock on the door. Her heart sank.
Who could that be?
Chapter 13. The Unseen Threads of Fate. Livia froze, her hand hovering over the half-packed bag, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The knock, firm and insistent, echoed through the small apartment, shattering the fragile silence. Who could it be? Raphael? Rossi? Or someone worse? She crept towards the door, her footsteps silent on the worn floorboards, her senses on high alert. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat as she saw who was standing on the other side. It wasn't Raphael. It wasn't Rossi. It was a woman she didn't recognize, a woman who looked both familiar and unsettling. The woman was tall and slender, with long, dark hair streaked with silver and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to pierce through the distorted lens of the peephole. She was dressed in a simple, elegant suit, her demeanor both confident and cautious. Livia hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know this woman, but there was something about her, something in her eyes, in her stance, that resonated with a deep, unsettling familiarity. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Livia Marchesi," the woman said, her voice low and clear, carrying through the door. "I know you're in there. Please, open the door. I need to talk to you. It's important." Livia's hand trembled as she reached for the chain, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, curiosity, suspicion, and a strange, inexplicable sense of hope. She unlatched the chain, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence, and slowly opened the door, just a crack, her hand still gripping the edge, ready to slam it shut if necessary.
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes searching the woman's face. The woman smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that softened her features, making her look less intimidating. "My name is Isabella," she said, her voice smooth and reassuring. "And I was a friend of your mother's." Livia's breath caught in her throat. Her mother? She had died when Livia was just a child, a victim of a car accident, or so she had always been told. She had few memories of her, only fleeting glimpses of a beautiful, kind woman with a warm smile and gentle eyes. "My mother?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes widening with disbelief. "But she's dead." Isabella nodded, her gaze softening with sympathy. "Understanding?"
"Yes," she said. "She is."
"But she left something behind. Something for you." Livia stared at her, her mind reeling. What was this woman talking about? What could her mother have possibly left behind? And why was this woman, a stranger, bringing it to her now? I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking.
"I know," Isabella said.
"It's a lot to take in. But please, let me in. I can explain everything." Livia hesitated for a moment longer, her instincts warring with her curiosity, her fear battling with her hope. But there was something in Isabella's eyes, something in her voice, that convinced her, that compelled her to trust. She stepped back, opening the door wider, a silent invitation. Isabella stepped inside, her presence filling the small apartment, making it feel different, safer, somehow. Isabella glanced around the room, her eyes taking in the faded wallpaper, the worn furniture, the air of quiet desperation that clung to the space. She didn't judge, didn't sneer. She simply observed. "You've been through a lot," she said, her voice gentle, her gaze returning to Livia. Livia nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Isabella said. "And I'm sorry. I wish I could have come sooner. But it wasn't safe. Not until now." She reached into her bag, a small, elegant leather satchel, and pulled out a small, wooden box, intricately carved and inlaid with mother of pearl. She held it out to Livia, her hand steady, her gaze intense. "This belonged to your mother," she said.
"She wanted you to have it."
"When you were ready." Livia took the box, her hands trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was heavy, solid, the wood smooth and cool beneath her fingertips. She could feel the weight of the past, the weight of secrets, the weight of her mother's love. She looked at Isabella, her eyes filled with questions, with confusion, with hope. "What's inside?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Isabella smiled, a faint, enigmatic smile. "The truth," she said. "The truth about your mother, about your father, about everything." She paused, her gaze holding Livia's. "Open it," she said. "It's time you knew." Livia looked down at the box, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings, her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. She was about to unlock the past, to uncover secrets, to confront truths that could change everything. What would she find? Chapter 14. A flicker of hope in the darkness. Livia sat down on the worn sofa, the wooden box resting on her lap, its weight a tangible presence, a link to a past she barely remembered, a mother she had lost too soon. Isabella sat opposite her, watching her with an expression of quiet intensity, a mixture of sympathy and anticipation. The small apartment felt strangely hushed, the sounds of the city muted, as if the world outside were holding its breath, waiting for the secrets within the box to be revealed. Livia took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the lid, the smooth, cool feel of the mother-of-pearl inlays. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. What did my mother do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze meeting Isabella's. "Why did she have to hide this?" Isabella sighed, her gaze softening with sadness. "Regret? Your mother was a remarkable woman, Livia," she said, her voice low and gentle. "Strong, intelligent, courageous. But she was also trapped. Trapped by her family, by her marriage, by the world she lived in." She paused, her gaze holding Livia's. "She wasn't supposed to marry your father," she continued. "Her family, the Castellanos, they had other plans for her. They wanted to arrange a marriage with another powerful family to strengthen their position, to increase their wealth." Livia nodded, her mind racing. She had always known that her parents' marriage had been unconventional. Her father, a Marchese, a man of power and violence, and her mother, a Castellano, a family known for their refinement, their culture, their subtle influence. "But she loved him," Livia said, her voice a statement, not a question. Isabella smiled, a faint, fleeting smile. "Yes," she said. "She loved him. Fiercely, passionately, irrevocably. She defied her family. She broke with tradition. She chose love over duty, over security. And they never forgave her," Livia said, her voice tinged with bitterness. Isabella nodded. "No," she said. "They never forgave her. They saw her as a traitor, a rebel, a threat to their power, to their control." She paused, her gaze shifting to the box on Livia's lap. "Your mother knew the risks," she continued. "She knew that her family would never accept her choice, that they would always be a threat to her, to your father, to you. So she hid this," Livia said, her fingers tightening around the box. "She hid the truth." Isabella nodded. "Yes," she said. "She hid the truth. For your protection. For your future." Livia looked down at the box, her heart aching with a mixture of love, grief, and anticipation. She was ready. She needed to know. She lifted the lid, the hinges creaking softly, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of letters, a small, silver locket, and a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Livia picked up the letters first, her hands trembling as she recognized her mother's handwriting, delicate and elegant, on the envelopes. They were addressed to her, to Livia, to be opened on her 25th birthday, a birthday she had never celebrated with her mother. She opened the first letter, her heart pounding against her ribs, and began to read. Her mother's words flowed across the page, a voice from the past, a message of love, of hope, of warning. She wrote of her love for Livia, of her dreams for her future, of her fears for her safety. She wrote of her family, the Castellanos, of their power, their ruthlessness, their secrets. She wrote of a conspiracy, a plot to control the alliance, to manipulate the families, to seize power for themselves. She wrote of her father's involvement, of his unwitting role in their schemes, of his betrayal, not by the Costas, but by her own family. Livia's blood ran cold. It was another twist, another layer of deception, another betrayal. Her own mother's family, the Castellanos, had been the true architects of her father's downfall, the masterminds behind the chaos that had engulfed their world. She opened the locket. Inside was a miniature portrait of her mother and a man she had never seen before. Not her father. Isabella explained that this was her mother's true love, a man her family forbade her to be with. That man was also revealed to be Don Angelo Rossi's brother. The families had been connected for much longer than Livia could have imagined. She picked up the folded piece of paper, her hands trembling even more violently now. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a list of names, names of powerful figures within the alliance, names of families, names of individuals who were secretly working for the Castellanos, who were plotting to overthrow the existing order, to seize control for themselves. At the top of the list, a name that made her gasp, a name that shattered the last vestiges of her trust, a name that revealed the depth of the betrayal, the scope of the conspiracy.
Lorenzo Costa.
He had been working with the Castellanos all along. Rafael's father had not destroyed her father to take power, but as a part of a much larger, much older, and more complex plan. And Rafael, where did he fit into all of this? Did he know? Was he involved? Or was he, too, a victim of his father's treachery, of his family's secrets? She looked up at Isabella with desperate eyes. There is one more thing, Isabella began. Chapter 15. The Taste of Forbidden Freedom. Isabella reached into her bag again and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. She held it out to Livia, her hand steady, her gaze filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Your mother wanted you to have this, too, she said, her voice soft, her words carefully chosen. She said it would help you, guide you, protect you. Livia took the pouch, her fingers closing around its soft, yielding texture. It was small, light, but it felt significant, imbued with a power, a presence that she couldn't quite explain. What is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching Isabella's. Isabella smiled, a faint, enigmatic smile.
It's a key, she said.
A key to your future. Livia opened the pouch, her fingers trembling, and poured its contents into her palm. A single, antique key, made of tarnished silver, lay nestled in her hand. It was small, intricate, its design both beautiful and unsettling. A key to what? Livia asked, her voice filled with confusion, with anticipation, with a flicker of hope. A key to a place, Isabella said. A place where your mother hid other things. Things that will help you understand. Things that will give you power. She paused, her gaze holding Livia's. It's a place in Florence, she continued. A small villa, on the outskirts of a city. It belonged to your mother's grandmother, a woman who defied convention, who lived life on her own terms. Florence, the city of art, of beauty, of secrets. Livia had never been there, but she had always felt a strange, inexplicable pull towards it, a sense of longing, of connection. Why didn't you tell me this before? Livia asked, her voice tinged with accusation? Resentment? Isabella sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands, her expression filled with regret. I couldn't, she said. It wasn't safe. Your mother made me promise to wait. To wait until you were ready. Until you were strong enough. She looked up at Livia, her eyes filled with admiration. And now you are, she said. You've survived. You've learned. You've grown. You're ready to fight back. Livia looked down at the key in her hand, her fingers closing around its cool, smooth surface. It was a tangible link to her mother, to her past, to her future. It was a symbol of hope, of possibility, of freedom. What do I do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze meeting Isabella's. Go to Florence, Isabella said. Find the villa. Unlock the secrets. Claim your inheritance. She paused, her gaze holding Livia's. And be careful, she added. The Castellanos are powerful. They won't give up easily. They'll be watching you, waiting for you. They already know about the meeting. They know you're a threat. Livia nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing with 1,000 new possibilities, 1,000 new dangers. She was stepping into a new world, a world of even greater intrigue, of even greater risk, but also of even greater potential. I will, she said, her voice firm, her gaze resolute. I won't let them win. I won't let them control me. I'll fight. Isabella smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile of approval, of pride.
Good, she said.
That's what your mother would have wanted. Isabella stood up, preparing to leave. I have to go, she said. They can't know I was here. Livia nodded, understanding. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude, with emotion. For everything. Isabella placed a hand on Livia's arm, a brief, comforting gesture. Be careful, Livia, she said. And remember, you're not alone. She turned and walked towards the door, her movements silent and graceful, disappearing as quickly as she had arrived, leaving Livia alone with the key, with the secrets, with the future. Livia looked down at the key in her hand, her fingers closing around its cool, smooth surface. She had a destination, a purpose, a mission. She was going to Florence. She was going to find the villa. She was going to unlock the secrets. She was going to claim her inheritance. She smiled, and, along the way, get her revenge. She stood, feeling a surge of newfound strength. She packed quickly, taking only the essentials, the letters, the locket, the list, the key. She left the apartment, the place that had been her sanctuary, her refuge, and stepped out into the night, into the unknown, into the future. She didn't know what awaited her in Florence, what challenges she would face, what dangers she would encounter. But she was ready. She was a Marchese. She was a Castellano. She was her mother's daughter. And she would not back down. As she hailed a taxi, she thought of Raphael. What would he do when he found out she was gone? Would he follow? Would he help? Would he betray? The questions lingered in the back of her mind. She had left him a note, a short, cryptic message, telling him only that she had to leave, that she had to find the truth, that she couldn't see him. Not now, not after she had discovered about his father. She hoped it was enough, but also, not enough. She needed time and distance to figure out what she was going to do, and what she was going to do about him. But first, Florence. Chapter 16. Reckoning with Old Ghosts. Florence welcomed Livia with a cool embrace, the city's ancient stones whispering stories of art, intrigue, and hidden passions. The air was thick with the scent of history, of secrets, of possibility. She found a small, discreet hotel near the Ponte Vecchio, a place where she could blend in, observe, and plan her next move. The villa, according to Isabella, was located on the outskirts of the city, nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany, a secluded haven surrounded by vineyards and olive groves. Livia spent the first day exploring the city, familiarizing herself with its labyrinthine streets, its hidden piazzas, its energy. She felt a strange connection to this place, a sense of belonging, of homecoming. It was as if her mother's spirit were guiding her, leading her towards her destiny. The next morning, she rented a small car, a Fiat 500, and drove out of the city, following Isabella's directions. The landscape changed gradually, the urban sprawl giving way to rolling hills, vineyards, and ancient olive groves. The air was fresh and clean, the scent of pine and wildflowers filling her senses. She found the villa easily enough, a small, elegant structure of weathered stone and terracotta tile, perched on a hilltop overlooking the surrounding countryside. It was secluded, hidden behind a wall of cypress trees, a place where secrets could be kept, where truths could be revealed. She parked the car and walked towards the villa, her heart pounding against her ribs, her hand clutching the silver key in her pocket. The gate was unlocked, as if waiting for her, inviting her in. She pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped into the garden. The garden was overgrown, wild, but beautiful, filled with fragrant flowers, ancient statues, and a small, stone fountain. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, of hidden memories. She walked towards the villa, her footsteps echoing on the stone path, her senses on high alert. The front door was also unlocked, the wood weathered and worn, but still solid, still welcoming. She inserted the key into the lock, her hand trembling slightly. It turned smoothly, the mechanism clicking softly, and the door opened, revealing a dimly lit interior, filled with shadows and secrets. She stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The villa was frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the windows, illuminating antique furniture draped in white sheets, paintings covered in protective cloths, and shelves filled with books and artifacts. It was a museum, a mausoleum, a testament to a life lived, a love lost, a legacy preserved. She began to explore, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the past. She uncovered furniture, revealing exquisite pieces of art, of craftsmanship, of history. She unveiled paintings, portraits of her ancestors, landscapes of the surrounding countryside, still lives of flowers and fruit. She found a library filled with books in Italian, French, and English, their leather-bound spines gleaming in the dim light. She found a music room with a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age, but still resonant. She found a study with a large, antique desk, its drawers filled with letters, documents, and photographs. She sat down at the desk, her heart pounding against her ribs, and began to explore its contents. She found letters from her mother to her grandmother, filled with love, with longing, with secrets. She found photographs of her mother as a young girl, her eyes bright with laughter, her smile radiant with joy. She found a hidden compartment, concealed behind a panel in the desk, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with her mother's handwriting, delicate and elegant, but also fierce, determined, unwavering. She began to read, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, love, and understanding. Her mother's diary was a chronicle of her life, her struggles, her fears, her hopes. It was a window into her soul, a glimpse of the woman behind the mask, the woman who had defied her family, who had chosen love over duty, who had fought for her freedom. She wrote of her love for Livia's father, of her initial infatuation, of her growing disillusionment, of her discovery of his involvement with the Castellanos. She wrote of her fear for Livia, of her desire to protect her, of her plan to expose the truth. She wrote of a meeting, a secret rendezvous, a confrontation with Lorenzo Costa, a desperate attempt to save her husband, to save her daughter, to save herself. Livia's blood ran cold. The diary ended abruptly, the last entry unfinished, the words trailing off, as if interrupted. She closed the diary, her hands trembling, her mind reeling. Her mother had known. She had known about the conspiracy, about Lorenzo Costa's involvement, about the threat to her life, to Livia's life. And she had tried to stop it. She had tried to expose the truth. She had failed. But had she? As she looked at the last page, something caught her attention. A small symbol had been drawn next to her mother's last words. A symbol that Livia had seen before. It was on the locket her mother had treasured, with the photo of Rossi's brother. What did it mean? She didn't know, but felt certain it would lead to more answers. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had to find out. She had to finish what her mother had started. Chapter 17. The Heart's Treacherous Path. The symbol haunted Livia, a cryptic clue left behind by her mother, a breadcrumb trail leading to she didn't know where. It was a simple design, a circle intersected by a horizontal line, with a small in the center. She had seen it on the locket, etched into the silver, and now, here it was again, in her mother's diary, a silent message from beyond the grave. She spent hours poring over the contents of the villa, searching for any other clue, any other reference to the symbol, but she found nothing. It was as if her mother had deliberately left it vague, a secret code that only Livia could decipher, a test of her intuition, her intelligence, her determination. She decided to return to Florence, to explore the city, to seek out any connection to the symbol, any hint of its meaning. She felt a strange, inexplicable pull towards the city's art, its history, its secrets. She visited museums, churches, libraries, studying paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, searching for any visual representation of the symbol, any clue that could shed light on its significance. She spoke to historians, art experts, archivists, but no one recognized it, no one could offer any explanation. Days turned into nights, and Livia's search became an obsession, a driving force that consumed her, that pushed her forward, that kept her from thinking about Raphael, about the pain of their separation, about the uncertainty of their future. She had tried to block him out of her mind, to focus on her mission, to uncover the truth about her mother, about her father, about the conspiracy. But he was always there, lurking in the shadows of her thoughts, a phantom presence that haunted her dreams, that made her heart ache with a longing she couldn't deny, a love she couldn't extinguish. One evening, as she was walking along the Ponte Vecchio, watching the sunset paint the Arno River in shades of gold and crimson, she saw him. Raphael, standing on the bridge, leaning against the railing, his gaze fixed on the water, his expression somber, lost, heartbroken. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart leaped into her mouth. Her legs felt weak and unsteady. She wanted to run to him, to throw herself into his arms, to feel his embrace, to hear his voice, to forget everything that had happened, everything that stood between them. But she couldn't. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only stare. He turned, as if sensing her presence, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. His expression changed, his face lighting up with surprise, with relief, with love. He started towards her, his steps quickening, his gaze unwavering, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. She wanted to run, to hide, to escape, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mixture of fear, desire, and hope. He reached her, his hands reaching out to her, his fingers touching her face, her hair, her arms, as if he couldn't believe she was real, that she was actually there, in front of him. "Livia," he said, his voice rough, his breath ragged, his eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken emotions. "I found you." She didn't speak, couldn't speak, her throat choked with emotion, her eyes filling with tears. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace tight, possessive, desperate, as if he were afraid she would disappear again, vanish into thin air, like a dream. She clung to him, her body trembling, her tears soaking his shirt, her heart aching with a mixture of joy, relief, and pain. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice muffled against her hair, his words a whispered confession. "I had to go," she said, her voice trembling, her words a choked sob. "I had to find out the truth." He pulled back slightly, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears, his eyes searching hers, questioning, pleading, loving. "What truth?" he asked, his voice low and gentle, his gaze intense. "What did you find?" She hesitated, her mind racing, her heart torn between her desire to trust him and her fear of betrayal. Could she tell him? Could she share her secrets, her discoveries, her fears? "Your father," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her words a painful accusation. He was working with them, with the Castellanos. He betrayed my father." Raphael flinched, as if she had struck him, his expression changing, his face paling, his eyes widening with shock, with horror, with shame. "I know," he said, his voice rough, his words strained. "I found out. After you left. I confronted him." Livia stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart pounding against her ribs. He knew. He knew about his father's betrayal, about his involvement with the Castellanos, about the conspiracy. What happened?" she asked, her voice barely audible, her eyes searching his. He sighed, his gaze dropping to his hands, his expression filled with pain, with regret, with anger. "He admitted it," he said, his voice low and bitter. "He admitted everything. He said it was for the good of the family, to protect us, to secure our future." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, aching emotion that mirrored her own. "I disowned him," he said, his voice shaking. "I told him I wanted nothing to do with him, with his legacy." Livia's breath caught in her throat. He had disowned his father. He had chosen her, chosen justice, over family, over loyalty, over everything. It should have been a triumphant moment, a moment that brought them together. But instead, it was tainted. It was all too much, too complicated. She looked into his eyes, seeing the raw emotion there. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Chapter 18. Unveiling the serpent's true face. The weight of their shared history, of their families' intertwined destinies, hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence that both separated and bound them together. Raphael's revelation, his disavowal of his father, had changed everything, yet nothing. The past could not be undone. The betrayals could not be erased. The scars could not be healed. I don't know, he said, his voice rough, his hands still cupping her face, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones, his eyes searching hers, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness, for love. But I know this, he continued, his voice firmer now, his gaze unwavering. I'm not my father, and I will not let him, or anyone else, hurt you. Ever. Livia looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to surrender to the love she felt for him, the love that had blossomed in the midst of darkness, of danger, of betrayal. But could she? Could she truly trust the son of her father's betrayer, the heir to a legacy of violence and deceit? Could she overcome the past, the pain, the doubt? I don't know if I can, she said, her voice trembling, her words a painful confession. It's too much. Too complicated. Too painful. He nodded, his expression understanding, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. I know, he said, and I don't expect you to forgive me, or my family, but I need you to know I'm on your side. I'll help you, in any way I can. He paused, his gaze holding hers, his words a solemn vow. I'll help you expose the Castellanos, he said. I'll help you bring them to justice. I'll help you reclaim your father's legacy. Livia's breath caught in her throat. His offer was tempting, seductive, dangerous. It was a chance to avenge her father, to uncover the truth, to find justice. But it was also a risk, a gamble, a step into the unknown.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching his. Why would you do that? Why would you betray your own family? He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because it's the right thing to do, he said. Because I love you. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, with emotion, with truth. He loved her. He had said it, confessed it, offered it to her, a fragile, precious gift in the midst of darkness, of danger, of uncertainty. Livia's heart ached, her body trembled, her mind reeled. She loved him too. She had tried to deny it, to suppress it, to extinguish it. But it was there, burning bright, a flame that could not be quenched, a love that had defied logic, reason, and history. She began, her voice choked with emotion, her words a hesitant surrender. I need time. He nodded, understanding.
I know, he said.
Take all the time you need. He released her, his hands dropping to his sides, leaving her feeling bereft, exposed, vulnerable. They stood there, on the Ponte Vecchio, the ancient bridge spanning the Arno River, the city of Florence surrounding them, a silent witness to their love, their pain, their uncertain future. They returned to Livia's hotel, the silence in the car heavy and a little awkward, the unspoken feelings and tension almost unbearable. When they arrived at her room, he paused at the door. Livia, he began. I know you need time. But please know, I will be there for you, whatever you need. He was sincere. She could see it in his eyes. She took a deep breath. Thank you, Raphael. For everything. She offered him a small, hesitant smile. He returned it, then left. Livia went inside, and prepared for bed. As she drifted asleep, she could not stop thinking of the symbol. She had to return to the villa, and search again. There had to be something she had missed. The symbol had to mean something. She fell into a fitful sleep, filled with dreams of her mother, the villa, and the symbol that refused to be deciphered. When she woke up the next morning, she was determined to find the answers. She had decided to trust Raphael. He was her only option, and her heart told her she was wrong. She contacted him, and within the hour, they were on their way back to the villa. As they approached the villa, Livia was once again struck by its beauty and serenity, and once again felt the pull of its secrets, which she hoped to soon unravel. They began their search again, starting with the study, retracing Livia's previous steps, examining every book, every document, every object, searching for any clue, any hint of the symbol's meaning. Hours passed, and they found nothing. Frustration mounted, Tension filled the air, and Livia's hope began to dwindle. "It's no use," she said, her voice filled with despair, her body slumping against the desk. "It's not here. I've looked everywhere." Raphael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his touch sending a shiver down her spine, a reminder of their connection, their love, their shared mission. "Don't give up," he said, his voice firm, his gaze encouraging. "We'll find it. We have to." He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, the ceiling. And then he saw it. High above the fireplace, hidden in plain sight, carved into the intricate stone mantelpiece, was the symbol. The circle, the line, the dot. It was small, subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. "Livia," he said, his voice filled with excitement, his finger pointing towards the fireplace. "Look." Livia followed his gaze, her eyes widening with disbelief, with relief, with understanding. There it was. The symbol. The key. The answer. She approached the fireplace, her heart pounding against her ribs, her hand reaching out to touch the symbol, its cold, smooth surface sending a shiver of anticipation through her. As she touched the symbol, she felt a faint click.
She had found something.
Chapter 19. A desperate gamble for survival. The click echoed in the silent room, a small, subtle sound that signaled a shift, a change, a revelation. Livia and Raphael exchanged a look of excitement, of anticipation, of trepidation. They had found something, a hidden mechanism, a secret passage, a clue. Raphael examined the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the outline of the symbol, searching for any other hidden buttons, levers, or triggers. He found a small, almost imperceptible indentation on one side of the circle, and he pressed it, gently at first, then with more force. Another click, louder this time, and a section of the wall behind the fireplace slid open, revealing a narrow, dark passage, a hidden stairway leading down. Livia's breath caught in her throat.
Un secret passage.
Just like in the stories, in the movies, in the legends. It was real. It was here. It was waiting. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Raphael looked at her, his expression serious, his gaze intense.
"We go down," he said. "We find out what's down there."
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, stone steps that descended into the unknown. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low and reassuring, his hand reaching out to her, offering her protection, support, comfort. Livia nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs, her hand gripping his, their fingers interlacing, a silent connection, a shared bond, a promise. They descended the stairs slowly, carefully, their footsteps echoing in the confined space, the air growing colder, damper, the scent of dust and mildew filling their nostrils. The passage was narrow, winding, the walls rough and uneven, the steps worn and slippery. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and the passage opened into a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves, filled with books, documents, and artifacts. It was another library, a secret library, hidden beneath the villa, a place where truths were concealed, secrets were kept, and destinies were forged. Raphael swept the flashlight beam across the room, illuminating the shelves, the books, the objects. Livia's eyes widened with disbelief, with wonder, with recognition. She saw familiar symbols, the circle, the line, etched into the spines of books, carved into the wooden boxes, embroidered onto the tapestries that hung on the walls. It was everywhere a recurring motif, a secret code, a key. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the mystery, the history, the power. Raphael shook his head, his expression equally bewildered, his eyes filled with awe.
"I don't know," he said.
"But it's important. Your mother hid this. She wanted you to find it." They began to explore, their hands reaching out to touch the books, the documents, the objects. Livia found a series of journals, bound in leather, their pages filled with her mother's handwriting, a continuation of the diary she had found in the study, a deeper dive into the conspiracy, the betrayal, the truth. She began to read, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing to keep up with the revelations, the secrets, the dangers. Her mother had uncovered the full extent of the Castellanos' plot, their plan to control the alliance, to manipulate the families, to seize power for themselves. She had identified the key players, the individuals who were secretly working for the Castellanos, the moles who had infiltrated the various families, the traitors who had betrayed her father. And she had discovered their ultimate goal, their endgame, their master plan. They were not just seeking power, wealth, influence. They were seeking something else. Something ancient, something powerful, something dangerous. They were seeking control of a legendary artifact, a mythical object said to possess immense power, the power to control, to dominate, to destroy. It was called the Serpent's Eye, and it was rumored to be hidden somewhere in Italy, protected by a secret society, guarded by ancient rituals. Livia's blood ran cold. The Castellanos were not just seeking to control the alliance, they were seeking to control the world. And they were willing to do anything, to sacrifice anyone, to achieve their goal. She looked up at Raphael, her eyes filled with fear, with determination, with resolve. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice firm, her words a declaration of war. "We have to find the Serpent's Eye before they do. We have to destroy it." Raphael nodded, his expression equally grim, his gaze resolute. "I know," he said. "And we will. Together." They continued to search the secret library, uncovering more clues, more secrets, more pieces of the puzzle. They found a map, an ancient hand-drawn map of Italy, with various locations marked with the symbol, the circle, the line, the dot. One location, in particular, stood out, circled in red ink, with a note written beside it in her mother's handwriting, the Serpent's Lair. It was a location in the south of Italy, a remote, mountainous region, a place shrouded in mystery, in legend, in danger. Livia looked at Raphael, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 fears, 1,000 hopes. "That's where we have to go," she said, her voice firm, her words a decision, a commitment, a challenge. "That's where we'll find the Serpent's Eye. That's where we'll stop them." But as they made their plans and gathered what they needed to take with them, the sound of shattering glass echoed from above. They were not alone. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the secret library, a jarring, violent intrusion that shattered the fragile peace, the tense anticipation, the shared hope. Livia and Raphael exchanged a look of alarm, of fear, of understanding. They were not alone. Someone had found them. Someone had followed them. Someone was coming for them. "Who is it?" Livia whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with apprehension. Raphael shook his head, his expression grim, his hand reaching for the small handgun he had concealed beneath his jacket. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and tense. "But we have to be ready." They moved quickly, silently, extinguishing the flashlight, plunging the library into darkness, relying on their instincts, their senses, their training. They positioned themselves near the entrance to the passage, hidden behind the shelves, waiting, listening, anticipating. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound of heavy boots on the stone steps, the rustle of clothing, the muffled voices speaking in Italian, rapid, urgent, angry. "They're coming down," Livia whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand gripping Raphael's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. He nodded, his grip tightening on the handgun, his body tense, his senses on high alert, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the passage, waiting for the confrontation, the battle, the end. The first figure appeared in the doorway, a large, burly man with a shaved head and a cruel face, his eyes scanning the darkness, his hand holding a gun, his finger on the trigger. Raphael moved swiftly, silently, stepping out from behind the shelves, raising his handgun, firing 2 shots in rapid succession. The man grunted, his body jerking backwards, his gun falling from his hand, his body collapsing onto the floor, a pool of blood spreading around him. More figures appeared in the doorway. 2, 3, 4, all armed, all dangerous, all determined. A firefight erupted, the sound of gunshots deafening in the confined space, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder, of blood, of death. Livia ducked behind the shelves, her heart pounding against her ribs, her body trembling with fear, but also with adrenaline, with determination, with rage. She was not a fighter, not a killer, but she would not cower, she would not surrender, she would defend herself, defend Raphael, defend their future. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small, antique pistol her mother kept hidden and that Livia had brought, along with the journals, from the secret compartment in the villa. It was small, elegant, but deadly. She had never fired a gun before, but she knew how. Her father had taught her, years ago, a lesson she had never forgotten, a skill she had never hoped to use. She peered around the shelves, her eyes searching for a target, her hand gripping the pistol, her finger hovering over the trigger. She saw one of the men, his back to her, firing at Raphael, and she took aim, her hand trembling, her heart pounding, her mind screaming. She fired, the shot echoing through the library, the bullet hitting the man in the back, his body jerking forward, his gun falling from his hand, his body slumping to the floor. Livia gasped, her body shaking with shock, with horror, with relief. She had done it. She had fired a gun. She had killed a man. The firefight continued, chaotic, brutal, deadly. Raphael moved with a skill and precision that both terrified and impressed her. He was a warrior, a protector, a killer. But he was also her love, her partner, her hope. One by one, the men fell, their bodies collapsing onto the floor, their guns silenced, their lives extinguished. Finally, the shooting stopped, the silence returning, heavy, oppressive, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing, by the dripping of blood, by the echo of death. Raphael emerged from behind the shelves, his face grim, his clothes covered in blood, his gun still in his hand, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any remaining threats, any hidden dangers. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse, his words a statement, a question, a relief. Livia emerged from behind the shelves, her body trembling, her legs weak, her gun still clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on Raphael, searching for reassurance, for comfort, for love. They stood there, in the midst of the carnage, surrounded by death, by violence, by the consequences of their choices, their actions, their destinies. But they were alive. They had survived. They had won.
For now.
They searched the bodies, finding weapons and a communication device. That is when they heard it. The faint, but unmistakable sound of approaching sirens. "We have to go," Raphael said, his eyes urging. Livia nodded in agreement. They quickly gathered the journals and the map, and made their way back up the hidden stairs and out of the villa. As they were speeding away in the car, Livia turned to Raphael.
"Who were they?"
Raphael took a deep breath. "The Castellanos. But they were led by someone I know. Someone I thought I could trust."
He paused.
"My cousin, Marco." The betrayal stung, but somehow wasn't surprising. It was a grim reminder of the dangerous world they were in, and even more, the dangerous game they were playing. Livia then remembered what Isabella had told her. That the Castellanos would know about the meeting, about her. That meant Rossi was the leak. It was all coming together, and Livia knew what she had to do. She looked at Raphael, her eyes firm. "We have to go to the Serpent's Lair."
Now.
Epilogue. The journey to the Serpent's Lair was long and arduous, a winding road through the rugged mountains of southern Italy, a landscape that mirrored the treacherous path they were walking, the perilous journey they were undertaking. The closer they got, the more palpable the sense of danger, of ancient secrets, of impending confrontation. They arrived at their destination under the cover of darkness, a remote, isolated valley, shrouded in mist, surrounded by towering peaks, a place where legends were born, where myths were made, where destinies were decided. The Serpent's Lair was not a building, not a structure, but a natural formation, a series of caves carved into the mountainside, a labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, and passages. It was a place of darkness, of shadows, of ancient power. They entered the caves cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors, their senses on high alert, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and determination. They followed the map, navigating the labyrinth, searching for the Serpent's Eye, the legendary artifact, the source of immense power, the object of the Castellanos' obsession, the key to control, to domination, to destruction. They encountered obstacles, traps, puzzles, challenges, remnants of the ancient rituals, the guardians of the secret, the protectors of the artifact. They overcame them, using their wits, their skills, their love, their bond, their shared purpose. Finally, they reached the heart of the lair, a large, circular chamber, its walls adorned with ancient carvings, its floor dominated by a large, stone altar, its ceiling open to the night sky, revealing the stars, the moon, the cosmos. And there, on the altar, resting on a bed of faded velvet, lay the Serpent's Eye.
It was not what they expected.
It was not a jewel, not a weapon, not a tangible object. It was a small, unassuming stone, smooth and dark, with a faint, pulsing glow, a subtle energy, a living presence. As they approached the altar, the air grew heavy, the temperature dropped, the silence deepened, and a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure they recognized, a figure they feared.
Lorenzo Costa.
He was older, frilier, but his eyes still burned with the same ambition, the same ruthlessness, the same madness. He was holding a gun, his finger on the trigger, his gaze fixed on Livia, on Raphael, on the Serpent's Eye. "So," he said, his voice raspy but firm, his words a mixture of triumph and despair.
"You found it. You found the key to everything."
Raphael stepped forward, his hand reaching for his gun, his body shielding Livia, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering.
"It's over, father," he said.
"Let it go. It's not worth it." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the chamber. "Not worth it?" he said. "It's everything. It's power. It's control. It's destiny." He raised the gun, aiming it at Raphael, his finger tightening on the trigger, his eyes filled with hatred, with madness, with desperation. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice trembling, his words a choked accusation.
"You sided with them."
"With the Marqueses. With her." Livia stepped forward, her gaze meeting Lorenzo's, her voice calm but firm, her hand reaching for the small pistol she had concealed in her pocket. "He chose justice," she said. "He chose love.
He chose the right thing."
Lorenzo's eyes flickered to her, his expression shifting, his face contorting with rage, with grief, with regret. "Love?"
he scoffed.
"There is no love in our world. Only power. Only survival." He turned his gaze back to Raphael, his finger tightening on the trigger, his intention clear, his fate sealed. But before he could fire, another figure emerged from the shadows, a figure that Livia recognized with a jolt.
"Rossi."
"It's over, Lorenzo," Rossi stated, his voice firm. He was holding a gun, aimed directly at the older man. Lorenzo turned to him, a look of stunned surprise on his face. "You?" he whispered, his voice shaking.
"Me,"
Rossi answered. "I've been playing the long game, Lorenzo. And you were always a pawn." Before anyone could react further, Rossi fired. Lorenzo fell. In the ensuing chaos, Rossi grabbed the Serpent's Eye and attempted to flee, but Raphael was faster. He tackled the older man, and in the struggle, the stone fell from Rossi's grasp. Livia moved and quickly retrieved it. They had it. They had won. But at what cost? The authorities arrived, alerted by the earlier gunfire at the villa. The Castellanos' conspiracy was exposed, their network dismantled, their dream shattered. Raphael and Livia stood together, watching the sunrise paint the sky with colors of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. They had faced the darkness, they had confronted the past, they had survived. They returned to Florence. With Lorenzo and Rossi gone, the alliance crumbled, and they were free to forge their own paths, make their own choices, and build a new world together. Livia finally understood the symbol it represented: balance. She knew their future would not be easy, but it would be theirs. They had the stone, but they had to decide what to do with it. Destroying seemed both too easy and too dangerous. Its power was too much. They thought of Livia's mother and of Rossi's brother, and decided that, perhaps, the best thing to do was to return the stone to where it truly belonged. And with that, they knew their next adventure had just begun. The end.